It's taken from John's Gospel, chapter 4, and verses 27 to 42. And after Judas has read the word, we've got to sing the item, so I'll just get out of the way.
So it's John chapter 4, and starting at verse 27. And at this point his disciples came, and they marvelled that he talked to the woman, yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" The woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, "Come see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" Then they went out of the city and came to him. In the meantime his disciples urged him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat of which you do not know." Therefore the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him anything to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to finish his work. Do you not say there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And he who reaps receives wages, and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not laboured, others have laboured, and you have entered into their labours." And many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, "He told me all that I ever did." So when the Samaritans had come to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his own word. Then they said to the woman, "Now we believe, not because of what you said, for we ourselves have heard him, and we know that this is indeed the Christ, the Saviour of the world."
Thanks very much, mate. Thanks very much. Right. Have you ever said to anybody with a look of disdain, "What are you doing?" Have you ever said that?
Yeah.
That's Alan's favourite phrase at the moment.
Is it? Oh, no. Oh. Yeah. Quite topical. Quite topical. And very often our eyes speak louder than our voice when that term is used. "What are you doing?" Well, she say it then. Did she say it then? All right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. There were occasions when Jesus himself, when his purpose was questioned, or his words, or his actions or deeds, it raised questions amongst those that were near at hand. And sometimes the questions were verbalized, they were actually spoken, and then sometimes the questions were just unspoken. We just didn't say nothing. And they were left pondering as to what he was going to do or what he was doing. And we find a number of occasions where Jesus, I suppose the one that stands out is when he said he was going up to Jerusalem, and the disciples said, well, in point of way type of thing, "What are you doing? You know they're waiting for you, and they're going to take you and imprison you and destroy you." And so there are times when they're spoken questions, and sometimes unspoken, where you just muse within the heart, "I don't quite understand what's going on here." That type of phraseology, I suppose, is used. And here in this situation that Judith kindly took for us for the reading, we find both spoken and unspoken questions, which are simply saying, "What are you doing?" And it's difficult sometimes for us to embrace what God wants to do. We try to circumvent it sometimes. I was praying this afternoon, and I prayed earlier in the week that God's will might be done in my life and in the lives of those that I know. And I think within a short time, I felt within my own heart promptings of this and that. Won't go into the roads of what I was thinking about, but the thoughts that dropped into my heart, and my response was this: no, 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 no. It's amazing how we respond, isn't it? You pray something, Lord, will you? And then when a prompting or a response comes back, and you feel your heart respond back straight away, no, it's not that road. Not that road, please. And we find here this situation with both the woman at the well and the disciples asking the Lord in layman language, what are you doing? She said to him, when Jesus opened the conversation at the well, on the first week that we looked at, or the second week that we looked at this chapter, you hear it in a voice. What are you doing? Why are you, a Jew, speaking to me, a woman of Samaria? That's a don't do. It's a don't do. Not only from her perspective, but when the disciples come, they think exactly the same. What on earth are you doing? Speaking to a woman. Now with her, she put it into words. With the disciples, they said exactly the same thing. They marveled that he was speaking to a woman. Yet they did not ask. It was unspoken. And sometimes that's what we like sometimes. Speaking of her, we found out last week that she went through stages. We read of people that come to Christ, and sometimes in the New Testament especially, it's just in a moment of time. This is a quick moment, mind you, one conversation, and she's brought to Christ. But he breaks it down into steps, the writer here. He breaks it down into steps, and her first perception of him is that he is nothing but a Jew. And by that I don't mean a derogatory term, but from her point of view, he is nothing but a Jew. Why is it that you, being a Jew, ask me, a woman of Samaria, to give you a drink? That's her first perspective of him. That's her first thought about him. And in his response, and in the second response that he gives, she comes back with him, and immediately in this conversation, her response is changed. The bias is put down just a little touch, and she has thoughts within her mind, because the words that he speaks draws a little bit more out from her, and she calls him sir. And that term sir is not just something that's flippant. It means a man of worth. It's sometimes translated in the New Testament as master. Sometimes a rabbi will be called master. And so it's that type of term. It's a term of respect, a term of honor, that within a short period, there are some people when they speak, isn't it? When you meet them for the first time, they speak, and all you want to do is just walk away. You don't really want to listen to it. You don't really want to get involved with it. Everything about it seems so brash, seems so rash, seems so silly in comparison to what you're thinking about. But this man, talking about water that can quench the thirst, suddenly draws out from her a statement of respect. Sir, she says, where will you get this water from? Sir, she says, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? And so immediately within this conversation, we find that the authority of Christ's voice, even in day-to-day conversation, the authority and clarity of his voice, of what he's talking about, draws out something from the individual. Then we find out, you see, first of all, she has a racial problem. He's a Jew. And then she puts that aside, and then there's the social problem. Because here's a man of authority here, a man of respect. And then it moves to a spiritual problem, really. It turns to the topic of religion, and she looks at him and says, well, are you a prophet then? Because I've never heard a man speak like this before. And by the end of the conversation, she's turning around and saying, well, we know that the Christ is coming. Are you the Christ? It's amazing how far he's taken her, isn't it? But it allows us to see step by step how minds and hearts and bias and various thoughts that we might have, they can be overcome. They can be overcome. And here, as she's speaking to him, we have the opening verse that Judith read from, verse 27. And it's a funny little comment that's made. The disciples have just come back from the city, and they brought food with them. They'd gone into the city of the Samaritans to buy food. It's amazing, mind, when your belly rumbles, how you put aside bias. You put aside differences for the sake of your belly. And so they went down into the city to buy food. And so we find that as they come back, she's ready to take away, to make her way from them. And it says this, and she leaving her water pot. The very thing that she'd gone out there for, water, was of little consequence to her now, and she leaves the water pot there. It's a lovely little similar type of situation we find in Acts chapter 12. We find there a lady by the name of Rhoda. And whenever we say Rhoda, we always think of Cliff and Rhoda, don't we? You know, those that knew Cliff the postie and Rhoda his wife. And immediately you think of Rhoda straight away. Obviously the same name, I know that. But it says about Rhoda, she was with a band of people in Mary's house in Jerusalem. And they're praying there because James has been executed, one of the apostles. And now the next day, Peter is going to be executed. And so he's waiting in prison, and they are praying in Mary's house that the Lord would undertake and deliver Peter. Now they're praying with great zeal and with great faith. And then there's a knock at the gate. So Rhoda is dispatched from the little prayer meeting to go up to the gate to open it and invite whoever is there. And this is what the book of Acts says. It says, when she recognized Peter's voice, for gladness of heart, she omitted to open the gate and ran back in to announce that Peter is at the gate. For gladness of heart. And so we find with Rhoda, you can picture it. We see it sometimes with children, sometimes, don't we? They can be so caught up with whatever's gone on that has taken their breath away, and they just go right up into the air. Rhoda was so excited. Isn't it strange that the very thing that they've been praying for was answered, but they didn't believe it? They said, perhaps it's his angel. Perhaps it's this, perhaps it's that. Isn't it amazing? I often wonder sometimes when people question other people's faith sometimes. What about their faith then? Where does that register? You see, God is very merciful and He's very gracious. And He will answer, it would seem, He would answer prayers that are not expected to be answered. At least, not in the fashion that it was answered. They're looking at, this is how we do it. This is how we do it. How much more then with this lady, when she's at the well, she is so overcome with what's within her heart, she leaves her water pot at the well. Has Christ ever been so important to you that that which you think is essential at that moment has to be put aside? Or is the water pot still the subject of your main concerns? She is so overcome with what she leaves her water pot and went into the city and spoke to the men. It's a wonderful verse in the book of Isaiah. It's a little bit out of context, but it's within context as well. And this is what it says. Therefore, with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. And in that day you shall say, praise the Lord. Call upon His name and declare His deeds among the people. That's exactly what this girl has done. She's drunken of those waters. She was looking for waters 150 foot deep. Or at least the well was. Waters that would have gathered. They weren't flowing waters. It wasn't a stream running down underneath there, some subterranean stream. It was just waters that would have gathered, that would have oozed through the ground levels. But Jesus said, I don't give waters that gather. I give spring waters, living waters. And she drank of those waters from the well that he gave her. And she was so filled with it all. With joy she drawn from the waters of the well of salvation. And with joy she gave praise to God. And with joy she went back to the city. And said to the men, come see a man that told me all that I ever did. Is not this the Christ? She had always walked, because of the way that we are with people sometimes, aren't we? We make judgments. Sometimes they're correct judgments, but sometimes that judgment can last within us, and we never change our mind about, even though they might change, we don't change. And you see them and you hear the news of them being, they're different now, or well, they don't do those things anymore now. But in the back of your mind, you've got that little marker there, but I remember. Now she walked to the well, usually by herself it would seem, at noon, which is unusual, as we mentioned. It was unusual for people to go at noon. Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. And so, as well as that, people who are despised as well. People who make fun of. So she never saw company at the well, more nor even. She went at noon, when no one would trouble her. It's enough problems in life sometimes you think, oh, just leave it, mate. Just leave it. There's enough problems for me to get on with. I don't want to hassle there at the well as well. And so she makes her way. And now she's saying she's doing something that perhaps she's never done before. Come to the well with me. Come see a man that told me all that I ever did. Is not this the Christ? Now, while this is, John just simply puts it, and they made their way to him. But then John puts in a little filler, because he says in, where is it? Around about verse 35. It says, in the meantime, the disciples have returned from the city now with the food. And they're expecting to see Jesus as they left him. Tired, thirsty, hungry. That's how they're expecting to find him. But he's been rejuvenated. He's had nothing to eat. He's had nothing to drink. And he hasn't had a nap. He hasn't catnapped at all. He's been busy in that time period, and yet he's rejuvenated. And they wonder, what's happened here? There's a lovely life story. I think the brother came to Penyrheol. It's either him or his brother, Harolan Popov. And he tells of a time when he's in a Bulgarian prison. And the Bulgarians the Bulgarian authorities were nasty. And they created a fear upon the whole of the church that just hovered over the whole of the church. But then there came these little spring flowers that popped up. And the Popov brothers were two of those flowers. And Harolan was arrested. And he was put into prison, into solitary confinement. And he was punished there. He was tortured there. One of the tortures was this, that they would get his two first fingers to lean against the wall like that. And they kept him like that for 3 days. No water, no food. If he dozed off to sleep, they kept slippers or they walked in their socks, so he didn't know that they were in the cell with him, so that they would hit him over the head with a rubber tube. And so that's how they beat him. Within the 3-day period, because of the tortures that he'd been going through, his legs had swelled almost as if he'd had elephantiasis. And so he was a man that was on the point of breaking. Nervous tension, everything. And yet the strange thing is, he was in the will of God. Isn't that an odd thing? To suffer like that and yet to be in the perfect will of God. And they left the room. And in their absence, someone else came into the room that rejuvenated him, that revitalized him, that gave him didn't give him a drink, didn't give him any food, but suddenly when the man who had been watching him, torturing him, mocking him, sneering at him, when he came into the room, he knew someone else had been there. He was taken aback. Because Brother Popoff was there, rejuvenated, still in the same position. Still looked as if his face had been chiseled out of a rock, still looked like that. And yet he'd been rejuvenated. And when they came back and saw Christ, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me. What's he saying? There is nothing better, boys, than to be in the will of God. Nothing better. We're not aware of the conversation that he had with the disciples when he said that he was going to Galilee and that he needed to go through Samaria. We have nothing of a witness of what the disciples said. But you wonder if they're scratching their heads and say, well, we don't do this, do we? We go across the other side of the river. That's the way we go. We double the length of the journey. He must be in a rush, but he wasn't in a rush. We'll find out just more in a moment. He's not in a rush. And they're scratching their heads, and he's in the perfect will of God. He must needs. What is it? The will of God takes him into Samaria. And he is absolutely revitalized. And so they're scratching their heads and say, well, we don't know what's happened. But he's not like he was. Because he's not tired, he's not thirsty, and he's not hungry. He was rejoicing in being where God wanted him to be. There is no better place. I can't guarantee that it'll be easy, man. That's probably me saying no, 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 no. I can't guarantee that. But there's no better place. And as he's talking to them, he's saying to them, now look, this is one of the secrets you've got to learn, boys. What secret? Don't go by first impressions. My mother was a type for it, I've told you before, haven't I? If you came into the house with me, if you were a girl or if you were a boy, my mother would weigh you up in 2 minutes. And if she didn't like you, if you had thick eyebrows, if your eyes were close together, all these different things, because I don't like him, I don't like the way he smirks, I don't like the way he laughs, that was it, you were written off. I remember one girl that I was going out with, my mother found out about it. She didn't meet her. I said, you leave her alone. But she did take a shine to Judith, right? I was always glad of. Not that I was a boy for the girls, but you do have a boy for the girls. Just another one there. Roger got his hand to his face. There we are. Don't go by first impressions. Set aside long-term bias. Difficult ones, aren't they? Don't judge by appearance. She's a Samaritan. And the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. And you say, well, where does it say this? In this chapter then? Where do you get this thing of, don't go by first impressions. Don't have long-term bias. Listen what he says in verse 35. He says, do not say there are still 4 months for harvest. For I say unto you, the fields are already white for harvest. Lift up your eyes and look. So we got a good idea. The harvest he's talking about, I would have thought, would have been the harvest in September, where the Feast of Tabernacles would be, where the final harvest is made for all the produce in the land. So we see whereabouts he is. He's around about the June period, perhaps. Maybe around about the day of Pentecost period. We know in an earlier chapter, the Passover is there. So maybe that's where he is. And he said, now look, you put aside these thoughts that you've got, these first impressions, this long-term bias that's ingrained in you. Set it aside. You think it's 4 months for harvest. I'm telling you now, the harvest is already ripe. Yes. And as he says that, who comes over the hilltop? Not just the woman, but the Samaritans joined her from the city. And they look, and as they're looking up at the fields, down come the road, comes the next harvest. Yes. And they turn and they urge him to stay with them for 2 days. That's proof he wasn't in a hurry. This is a sad reflection on Jewish religion at that time. Before he went to Samaria, he left Judea for the reason of envy. That he was baptizing more disciples than John. Not that John was envious, but the Pharisees, the rulers of the religion of that area, were envious of it. And for envy he left and made his way to Galilee. And by the time he gets to Galilee from here, we find that it's not envy is his trouble there, it's familiarity. We know his mother, we know his brothers. He's just a carpenter boy. And so he leaves Galilee quite quickly. He just does one miracle then, comes back out again. It's not all a bed of roses in Galilee, is it? There are barriers to break down in Galilee. It's not all sweetness there. There's difficulties there, not as hard as Judea. But when he comes to the Samaritans, he stays there for 2 days. Sincerity keeps him there. Envy causes him to leave. Familiarity causes him to leave. Sincerity draws him and keeps him there for 2 days. A marvelous thing, isn't it? If you can just put aside our bias, put aside our judgments, our appearances, and all those different things that become so important to us. Verse 35, I think it is, or 39 says this: many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the words of the woman who said, he told me all I ever did. And when they came to him, they urged him that he would stay with them for 2 days. It's amazing what a testimony can do, isn't it? That's me up here. But you could just hear someone one day giving their testimony of how they came to Christ. Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. She couldn't go down into the doctrines. He'd broken down the doctrines for her, the difficulties she was having. He had put those things to rest. So she's not going to get involved in a doctrinal argument. She's just going to say, come see a man that knew me inside out and still talked to me. That still gave me time. And so the Samaritans come. They could see the change in the woman. You can see a change in a person when they come to Christ. When Wesley led possibly the first man he ever led to Christ, before Wesley himself was a Christian, he was in, what do they call it, death row. The man had been stealing sheep. You can't believe it, can you? And he's going to be hanged for it. Obviously the 1700s. And Wesley goes to him and reads to him from the prayer book and quotes certain scriptures to him. And Wesley is astonished. For the man bowed his head with tears, fearful of the consequences of his thieving. And by the time Wesley had finished praying, the man lifted his eyes, and there he was. He said you could see the peace of God in him. You could see it. The transaction had been that quick. And so we find with this woman the change that had gone on there. In closing, it says in verse 41, many more believed because of the words of Jesus. Then they said to the woman, now we believe, not because of what you've said to us, for we have heard him ourselves, and we know, not believe, we know. It's a couple of words John likes. In the Gospel of John, it's believe. And it's not believe in the past, it's keep believing. It's always keep believing with John. We can't pick it up in our English language. But when you come to his letters, it's about knowing. We know. We know. This is how you know. We know. And notice what the Samaritans say. We know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world. If he can save us, we can save anybody. That's what they're saying. If he can save us, he can save anybody. And so we find with this wonderful conversation that's coming to a close, he had to go through Samaria to meet this woman. And the woman went and brought the city out there, and many believed. Many more believed, and came to know that this is indeed the Christ, the Saviour of the world. Is he that to you? Is he the Saviour? Is he the Saviour of your soul? I heard some lovely news this week that a lady Susanna visits, that she's spoken to over the years, has attended church for years, and yet had never known that assurance, never knew what it was to say, I know that he's the Christ, the Saviour of the world. And Susanna led her to Christ with tears and tender spirit. It's a marvellous thing, isn't it? Now, testimony again, see. I don't know, do you know if you're saved? The lady said to her. Yes, you can know. No one needs to tell you. You can know it yourself. And there, in a moment, the lady came to Christ. Not a cross in sight. Not an altar in sight. Nothing like that. But she came to Christ. I know he's my Saviour. Is he your Saviour?